Just like the inventory, the projectiles are also made into two parts. The first is the launcher, which is basically your gun. It decides the speed of the ammo, the type of the ammo, and it manages when to shoot and how to shoot and where to shoot. The second is the AGR projectile, which is the actual projectile that your gun or your weapon will shoot. So first of all, let's go over the functions and variables of the AGR launcher. To add the AGR launcher, all you need to do is go to the components. If you want to check them again, you can always just visit our documentation. We have all of the variables listed there, what they do, what they are for, and all the functions too. In the weapons section, we have projectile initial speed. This is the projectile's initial speed when spawned. Then we have the add owner speed, which is, if it's true, it'll basically add the owner's current velocity to the projectile. And then we have fire interval, which is basically how the interval for which the weapon should fire. Basically, this is your fire rate too. And then we have fire spread. This is calculated at a randomized angle for every new projectile that is spawned. You can overwrite some functions to change how it is calculated, which we will go over later on. Then we have the burst count, which is the maximum amount of ammo that will be shot. Now you might realize that I'm calling ammo and projectiles. These are two separate different things, which we will go over later on. But basically, burst count is how many times you will try to fire ammo. And then we have burst cooldown. This is delay between the bursts once a burst is completed before it can be re-triggered. And then we have fire mode. We have a bunch of fire modes. We have semi-auto, full auto, burst, interruptible burst, and then custom. The difference between interruptible burst and the burst is, in simple burst, if you start shooting, you won't stop shooting until it has completed the burst count. Whereas in interruptible burst, you can stop shooting whenever you want. And then we have custom, which you can use to create your own shooting mechanic. Now let's have a look at the optimization panel. First off, we have the limit shots per frame. Basically what this does is it will make sure that the number of bullets that you're shooting does not exceed your frame rate, because if it does exceed your frame rate, then it's possible for multiple projectiles to be spawned at the same location, which can create collision issues with the projectiles. After that, we have client safe spawn distance. This is kind of your basic anti-cheat solution. It will compare the client's location to the server's location for shooting projectile, and if the difference exceeds this value, it will disregard the client's spawn transform and just take the server's spawn transform. And then we have the client aim correction. If it is true, the client will be allowed to send its aim origin and rotation to the server. Then we have client screen space aim coordinates. This is the screen space coordinates, so it's gonna be between 0 and 1, and it is used to calculate the client's camera aim. Basically, this is the position of your crosshair on the screen where you want it to be, because not all games have it on the center, so if you want it a little bit below, you can adjust that here. Then we have client aim trace distance. This is the distance to trace from client screen space coordinates into the world. It is used to calculate the client aim correction. And then we have auto update ignore list. If it is set to true, actors that are ignored by the projectiles will be updated every time big on fire is called. In the next section, we have ammo. Now here is the difference between projectiles that spawn and the ammo consumption. The ammo consumption per shot, it is the amount of ammo that is consumed per shot. If it is set to 2, then every time you press the trigger to fire the weapon, it will consume 2 bullets. If it doesn't have 2 bullets, it will not consume anything. And just because you're consuming 1 ammo doesn't mean you're gonna spawn just 1 projectile. And then we have projectile spawn amount. This is basically the amount of projectiles to spawn per shot. So every time you shoot, if you set it to 1, it's gonna spawn just 1 projectile and consume 1 ammo. And if your ammo consumption is set to 1 and you set the projectile spawn amount to 8, then it's still gonna consume just 1 ammo, but it's gonna spawn 8 projectiles, and all the 8 projectiles will have their own different fire spread calculated. This setting is very good for making weapons like shotguns and any other fancy weapons that you might have in mines, I don't know, magic projectiles or something. And then we have ammo count. This is the amount of available ammo for shooting. This is not your max ammo. This is basically when I press begin play, this is the amount of bullets I will have ready in the gun. Your maximum ammo and reloading stuff you will have to manage yourself. We have reload functions which change the ammo count, but that's kind of it. Playing the animation and how much ammo it needs to replenish is gonna be on you. This is a very useful and interesting thing. This is ammo sequence, and what it basically does is it defines a sequence of projectiles that will be cycled through when firing a shot. Right now I have just magic projectile here, but if I go into my Tech 9, you will see that I have 5 different sequences here. I have a bullet, I have a bullet, I have a bullet, bullet, and then bullet special. Bullet special is the grenade that you saw. So what this basically does is that every 5th bullet will be a special bullet, and of course you can change the ammo sequence on runtime, so it can be very useful for making weapons with special buffs or debuffs, and it can be any type of projectile. It doesn't have to just be one of these projectiles, so very interesting system. Then we have user data. This is the weapon damage value passed to the spawn projectile. And then the weapon tags. This is the tags that you can add to the weapons that will be transferred to the projectile, so you can access them in a projectile. Like if I can access them here, I have weapon damage and weapon tags. So the projectile itself doesn't need to have a hard-coded fixed damage. You can just transfer it from the weapon. You can also make a system which is basically damage multiplier if you want to make a system like that. So really up to you, but we provide you the option to do this. The weapon tags, they can be used for very fun things actually. You can make weapons that have special extra buffs, like it does fire damage, ice damage, or something like that, extra critical shots or something like that. And then you can use weapon tags, and then during the damage calculation you can check for certain tags and apply those kind of damages separately. So again, we're just providing you a framework to create very customizable weapons. And after the user data we have states. States are also very self-explanatory. This is safety lock enabled, which is basically if the safety lock is unable to prevent firing. It's kind of like how guns work. If you set it to true, you won't be able to fire no matter what. If you set it to false, you can fire. And then we have ammo, infinite ammo enabled, which is not going to consume any ammo at all, and you can just basically fire unlimitedly. And then we have our debug. If you set this is actually a value that is also passed to the projectiles. If it is set to true, then we can see the projectile trajectory. Basically the projectiles will be very debug visible, and it will also show events for events like ricochet, penetration, and terminal hits. And then we have the debug duration of that projectile and those messages. And this concludes the overview of the projectile launcher's variables. Now we will go over the projectile launcher's events and event dispatchers. Okay, so now let's go over the AGR projectile launcher. Actually, most of these functions are just called internally. You don't need to call them, you don't even need to work with them. They're just controlled called internally when we are firing the weapon. But if you're creating your own custom firing logic, or if you're overwriting the firing logic, then you might need this. But we'll still go over them. This is basically the function that calculates your client aim correction. Then we have apply client aim correction. This function will actually calculate the aim, origin, and rotation and then send it to the server. So you can call it from the client, and the client will do that, which is basically calling this and then sending it to the server. Then we have calculate fire spread. This is also a function that you can override to create your own fire spread mechanic. And then we have built ignore actor list. This is the actors that will be passed to the projectiles so that the projectiles cannot collide with them, because we do not want the projectile colliding with us or our weapons or anything. This is also a function that you can override and add it yourself. And after that we have weapon tags. These are pretty basic. If you watched the locomotion video, you know it's very similar to those. You can add tag, remove tag, and you can then replace all of the tags with this command. And then in the ammo stuff we have consume ammo. This will consume the amount of ammo that you have specified. If it says ammo consumption is 1, it'll consume 1 ammo. If it's 2, it will consume 2 ammo. Again, these events you most likely won't have to call yourself. We call it, the projectile component automatically calls them and everything. But if you want to create your own system, you can use this. We have set ammo count, we have set ammo sequence, which will change the ammo sequence to new sequence. And then we have is infinite ammo. And then we have some getters for getting the current ammo is infinite and getting the ammo sequence. Now in these events, what you need to make sure is that these events are called on server only. If you call them from client, they won't work. These are just for the servers. And same goes for these 3 events too, because we don't want the client to be able to just set whatever. And then we have our actual firing stuff. We have events to change your safety lock, then we have events to change your fire mode, then we have the event to reload your weapon. This is basically what your new ammo count is going to be, most likely your max ammo, and then calculation of how much ammo you have in your inventory. And then we have reset ammo sequence index. This basically means that if you have 5 different bullets set on this bullet and the reset ammo sequence index is false, then when I reload the weapon and start shooting again, I'll start from this bullet. So the second bullet will be the special bullet. But if you have that set to true, then whenever I reload, it'll also reload the index for this list, so it'll go back to 0, picking from wherever it left. And then we have some getters for canfire is safety lock enabled and get fire mode. And then we have these 2 events, server begin fire and server end fire, are the main events that you're going to be using to creating your firing sequence. This is basically trigger press and trigger release. These are the events that you're going to call for the weapon to fire. And the spawn projectile is when you want to manually spawn a projectile. So let's say if you are making your custom firing mechanic, you're going to use this event to spawn a projectile. These events must be called from server only. These 2 events can be called from the client because these are basically your trigger input. And another thing you should keep in mind is everything with the lightning arrow and the CPU on it is a server only event. Do not call it from client. Now let's go over the overwritable events. I showed you the client fire spread before. You can place your own fire spread calculation here. And then we have can fire, which is again, if we can fire a weapon, if we can't fire a weapon. This already calculates like the safety and everything, but if you want to change or if you want to add more restrictions to the weapon, you can do that here. And then we have a bunch of calculated or anything, you can again just do that here, get projectile class. After that we have get safe projectile spawn location. This is sort of like our anti-cheat to make sure that the projectiles are spawning from the correct location. And if you have your own system you kind of want to use, you can do that here and just return the value that the projectile should be spawning at. After that we have a bunch of perform burst fire, sim and end fire, custom fire, and single end fire and single fire. These are your actual firing events. You can override them to create your own firing mechanic. You might notice that there isn't a semi-auto and full auto firing events here. Those firing modes utilize the single fire event and it just calls it multiple times. And then we have our reload weapon, which you can override how to change reload mechanic. And then we have the spawn mechanic. Now this is the main event that actually spawns the projectile and calculates everything. If you want to change that, you can do that here. And after this we have a bunch of event dispatchers that we're gonna go over. So if I head over to my character, I am doing with this very simple interface to Tell the weapons to start firing when I press the fire and to stop firing when I release the fire key. Bullet firing sequence ends, so once all the bullets that were supposed to be spawned in that ammo count have been spawned and fired, this event will be called, and you can apply your fancy effects, montages, or your recoil here. And then we have projectile spawn. The difference between this and the weapon fired is this is called after all the projectile for that ammo count has been spawned, and this is called after every single projectile spawned. So that's the difference between them. Then we also have burst fire finished. So whenever a burst fire sequence has successfully finished, and if it's not finished, it was interrupted, like you released your click or you ran out of ammo or something, then this will be called. We also have on weapon reloaded to let us know that the weapon was successfully finished reloading. Then we have on ammo sequence updated. This is if you call the event set ammo sequence. If this successfully sets it, this event is called. Then we have on ammo count updated. Basically you can bind it to your ammo counter on the UI to show the current ammo count. This is called on everything, the client and the server. The only server only events are the ones with the lightning arrow and the CPU. Then we have our safety lock updated, fire mode updated, the current fire mode, and these are just the basic component events. These are not exclusive to the Projectile Launcher, this is just Unreal events. That is our overview of the Projectile Launcher. And after doing our projectile overview, we're gonna go over how we are actually calling these events and how we are reloading the weapon and setting the targets and everything. We'll show that too. But first, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go over the projectiles itself, how they are set up, their events, their variables and everything. Now let's look over the AGR projectiles. We actually have two different types of projectiles. So if you search projectile, AGR projectile, you'll see AGR projectile base, and then there is AGR projectile. This AGR projectile has the collision and the penetration and stuff on it. Meanwhile, the AGR projectile base is like for a lower class implementation if you want even more control over your projectiles. You can read more about the projectile base in our documentation. You're most likely going to use AGR projectile, so we are gonna go use that in this video. So I've already created a projectile. If I go to its class default and scroll down to the 3S Studio AGR section, in it we have two categories, projectile and optimization. These are very simple and easy to understand, self-explanatory. We have projectile radius. This is basically the radius of your collision that the projectile is gonna be using. We have penetration trace channel, which is gonna be used for calculating penetration and the collision for the penetration. Then we have bounce limits, it's how many times you can bounce. You can drag it to more than 3, but you can actually set value to whatever you want. Then we have ricochet factor. This is influenced by a lot of things, by your projectile's velocity, its angle of hitting, and then also the material that it hits. But this is the most control you will have over the ricochet. It's from here. This is kind of like your multiplier also for the ricochet. So what are the chances of the ricochet? It's gonna calculate that. Then we have penetration power. This is basically how many centimeters of a material you can penetrate at the velocity of 10,000. If you want something with more penetration power, basically you set it to higher. If you want something to have low penetration power or zero penetration power, you set it to 0 or a lower value. Then in the optimization, we have one option. You're not gonna have the second option. This is just a custom thing that was made for this showcase, and it's just gonna be server correction. Basically what it does is it'll make sure that the rotation of the projectile will be replicated across different clients on the server. This is very useful for slower moving projectiles or projectiles like arrows that need to point toward a certain direction. And if you set it to false, then the clients might see very weird rotations on the projectile. But for fast moving projectiles, you do not need it, so no need to turn it on. And now let's have a look at the events of the projectiles. We have calculate post penetration values, which is basically calculating the new velocity and the new penetration power of the projectile. Then we have can penetrate, where we get our hit result and our velocity and we see if we can penetrate it. And then we have can ricochet, very similar to this. Then we have calculate bounce transform and calculate hit transform. And this help a function called actor velocity rotation, which finds the rotation of an actor based on its velocity. These functions, most likely you're not going to be using them, but if you're making your own system, if you're using the projectile base, you're probably going to use them, or you're going to need them. So you have these available if you want to, but most likely you're not going to need them. Then in the overwritable functions, we have calculate post penetration value if you want to change how the penetration values are calculated and how the ricochets are calculated. You can do that here. And then we have some events that are called actually you won't see them here. You need to right click and type in projectile head and you'll get it here. I have already added them here. So these are the three functions. Projectile terminal hit, this is when your projectile comes to a stop, when it has hit the last thing it's going to hit. Then we have projectile, this actually event is gonna be calculated before the projectile is destroyed. The projectile gets destroyed automatically, that all is handled. Then we have event on projectile ricochet, this is where it was ricochet, the bouncing transform, the hit result of the ricochet, and the number of bounces, the velocity, the new velocity, and basically you got all that information here. Then we have projectile penetrated. This is the entry wound, you might call it, and then the exiting wound, and the velocity of the projectile that we had on this penetration. These events are for showing the appropriate effects or even letting the player know in the UI. But these are server only events, so if you want to tell client any information about it, you're gonna have to use RPC codes like I'm using here to show the hitting effects. That is all for the variables, events, and dispatchers of AGR projectiles. And if we go into the variables, you will see we have a bunch of variables available to us that you can use. Basically for projectile speed, penetration, and ricochet. And then we also have damage and the weapon tag that we went over earlier. We also have them available in the projectile. And if you want to change the projectile's penetration trace or anything, you can do that, but you need to make sure that you do it on the server and the client so that the client can predict it accordingly and the server is behaving accordingly. And that is kind of it for the projectiles. Those are all the events and the variables. And now we'll go over the implementation that we showed before and how we're doing things in that. So if I head over to my character, I am doing this very simple interface to tell the weapons to start firing when I press the fire and to stop firing when I release the fire key. And this takes us to our weapon. If you go into our weapon, I'm using this interface. Now this is a custom interface I made. You have to make your own, or you don't even need to use the interface. You can just use get projectile launcher component, and you can use that here and call the server begin fire and end fire just from here without using the interfaces. But I'm using it here because I might want my weapons to do some other things than just firing, like my melee weapons. So what we are doing here is we are telling our projectile launcher to start firing or end firing, and that's kind of it what you need to do to make a weapon fire. Now it'll fire accordingly. Your rotation might be off by 90 degrees, so you should change your rotation. Mine isn't, but it's just how the things are calculated. So if it's offset by a very specific value, just unrotate it that much and you'll be good to go. You can also just set the value of projectile launcher procedurally based on your weapons and muzzle sockets and whatever, but that's just basic Unreal tutorials. And then what I'm doing after firing is on weapon fired, I'm using this event to spawn some firing effects and then also to play mode touch for the firing and to tell my client that I'm firing a weapon and add some stages according to that. When I press reload, this event is called. It checks if I have the authority to make sure it's only called on the server. I am getting all items by class because I'm actually taking the ammo out of the inventory. So I'm getting my inventory, getting the ammo item, and then removing a stack for that and reloading the weapon by just that one single count because I'm removing one bullet. I'm only using the reloading mechanic in the crossbow, so it needs to reload by just one. The TAC-9 and everything is unlimited ammo, so I don't need to reload them. But this is your basic setup for reloading. You're gonna have to do more calculation here to calculate the max ammo and how much the stack is allowing you to decrease and everything. And that's the basic setup of your weapons. Now, I don't really have a specific key that I'm pressing to reload. The reloading is happening automatically. And how that is happening is I have a separate class for my crossbow derived from the same master class, but I'm overwriting the weapon fire event and making it reload. So whenever a weapon finished firing, it will reload the weapon to one count. So the crossbow always sort of has an ammo that it takes from our inventory. And now another thing for you might have realized is the crossbow, we are actually able to pick back up the bolts that we fired. And how are we doing that? That's again the combination of inventory and the projectile. So in my projectile, what I'm doing is on my terminal head, I'm basically spawning a BB actor arrow, which is a pickable arrow. It has the AGR item component, so we can pick it up, and it basically just spawns it on the same transform. And that is how you can pick the arrows back up.